Imagine a planet where the land is a mistake, a rare and fleeting exception to a rule of endless blue. If you were to hover in a geostationary orbit directly above the center of the Pacific Ocean, you would see almost no continents at all. You would see a hemisphere of water so vast that it could swallow every single landmass on Earth and still have room for another Africa. This is the Great Void, the largest single feature on our planet. And for most of human history, it was the ultimate frontier. We often speak of the Silk Road or the age of Atlantic exploration as the pinnacle of human journeying, but those were mere strolls across a backyard compared to the settlement of Oceania. This is not just a story of islands, it is a story of how a terrestrial species learned to inhabit the liquid majority of their world. To understand Oceania, we must first look at the silence before the noise, the geological and biological foundations of a realm that exists at the edge of the impossible. To the untrained eye, the islands of the Pacific seem scattered like accidental crumbs across a table. However, there is a profound, violent logic to their placement. Most of these islands were born from the Ring of Fire, a massive horseshoe of tectonic activity where the Pacific plate grinds against its neighbors. Here, the Earth's crust is thin and angry. Deep beneath the waves, magma pushes through fissures, cooling instantly in the frigid depths, layer upon layer, until a mountain peaks above the surface. These are the high islands like Hawaii or Tahiti, towering basalt monoliths that catch the clouds and create their own weather. But there is another kind of island, one characterized by patience rather than violence. These are the atolls. They began as volcanic peaks, but over millions of years, the heavy basalt began to sink back into the sea. As the mountains subsided, colonies of coral grew upward around the fringe, keeping pace with the sinking stone. Eventually, the volcano vanished entirely, leaving only a circular crown of living reef surrounding a quiet lagoon. Before the first human foot touched these shores, Oceania was a series of biological experiments. During the Pleistocene, when the Earth was locked in an ice age, sea levels were significantly lower than they are today. This created two massive land masses that no longer exist in our current geography. The first was Sunda, a peninsula of Asia that included modern-day Indonesia and Malaysia. The second was Sahul, a giant continent that joined Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania into a single entity. Separating these two land masses was a deep-water trench known to modern science as the Wallace Line. Even when the oceans were at their lowest, this trench remained a formidable barrier of deep, open water. On the western side, you found placental mammals, tigers, rhinos, and elephants. On the eastern side, in Sahul, evolution took a different path entirely, favoring marsupials and unique avian life. To cross from Sunda to Sahul was to enter a different world. It was into this world that the first great wave of migrants arrived, roughly 65,000 years ago. These were the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians and the Papuans. They did not possess the advanced sailing technology of the later Polynesians, yet they achieved something staggering. They crossed the deep water gaps of the Wallace Line, likely using simple rafts or canoes, becoming the first humans to leave the Afro-Eurasian landmass. For tens of thousands of years, these people flourished in the vast forests of New Guinea and the arid expanses of Australia. They developed complex social structures and deep spiritual connections to the land, living in a relative isolation that allowed their cultures to become some of the oldest continuous traditions on the planet. But the deeper reaches of the Pacific, the thousands of islands in the Central and Eastern Ocean, remained silent. They were too far, too small, and too hidden for the technology of the time to reach. Then, about 5,000 years ago, a revolution began. It started on the island of Taiwan. A group of people, whom we now call Austronesians, began a migration that would eventually become the most expansive maritime expansion in human history. These were not just refugees or accidental drifters. They were the most sophisticated maritime engineers the world had ever seen. Their secret weapon was the outrigger canoe. By attaching a secondary float to the side of a hull, they created a vessel that was incredibly stable in the rough swells of the open ocean. This allowed them to carry not just people,
but livestock, seedlings, and supplies. They were moving houses, floating ecosystems designed to transplant an entire way of life onto whatever speck of land they might find on the horizon. These voyagers moved south through the Philippines and into the islands of Indonesia, eventually meeting the descendants of the first wave in New Guinea. What followed was a cultural synthesis that birthed the Lapita culture. The Lapita are famous among archaeologists for their distinctive pottery, decorated with intricate geometric patterns stamped into the clay. But their real legacy was their courage. Around 1500 BCE, the Lapita people broke out of the coastal fringes of New Guinea and headed into the remote Oceania. They pushed into the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, Fiji, and Tonga. For the first time, humans were moving beyond the sight of land, navigating by nothing but the stars and the rhythms of the sea. This brings us to the most remarkable aspect of the Oceania story, the science of wayfinding. To the European explorers who would arrive thousands of years later, the ability of Pacific Islanders to find tiny specks of land in the middle of a featureless ocean seemed like magic or sheer luck. It was neither. It was a rigorous, highly developed system of non-instrument navigation. A master navigator did not need a compass or a map. He held the map in his mind, constructed from a lifetime of observation. He knew the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars. He could feel the direction of the dead swells, the deep, rhythmic pulses of the ocean that indicate the presence of distant land masses. He watched the flight patterns of birds like the fairy tern or the frigate bird, which fly out to sea to fish but must return to land at night. He looked for the teal of the water, a slight change in the color of the ocean surface reflected from the shallow lagoons of hidden atolls. The master navigator was the most important person in the community. His knowledge was a sacred trust, passed down through oral traditions and practiced in secret schools. To be a navigator was to be a living computer, constantly processing data from the wind, the sun, and the bioluminescence in the water. They understood that the ocean was not a barrier, but a highway. Where a continental person might see the water as the end of the world, the people of Oceania saw it as the thing that connected them. The islands were just the anchor points in a vast, fluid nation. By 10,000 BCE, the foundations of this maritime empire were set. The Lapita had reached the edge of the Polynesian Triangle, a massive area bounded by Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. They were standing at the threshold of the deep Pacific, preparing for the final, most daring stage of their journey into the great unknown. They had mastered the tools and the stars, but the ocean ahead was wider than anything they had ever faced.
Standing at that threshold, however, the momentum did not immediately carry them forward. Instead, a strange silence fell across the archaeological record, a period known to historians and anthropologists as the Long Pause. For nearly 2,000 years, the rapid eastward expansion that had defined the Lapita people simply stopped. They had reached the archipelagos of Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, and there they remained, as if the ocean had suddenly become an impenetrable wall rather than a welcoming path. This hiatus is one of the great enigmas of Pacific history. Was it a shift in climate? A change in wind patterns, like the intensification of El Niño cycles? Or perhaps a technological bottleneck? While the reasons remain debated, what we do know is that during these 20 centuries of relative stillness, the Lapita identity dissolved and reformed into something entirely new, the Polynesian culture. In the sheltered bays of Tonga and Samoa, the settlers were not merely waiting, they were adapting. They were refining their relationship with the land and the sea, developing the specific linguistic and social structures that would eventually define the most expansive maritime culture the world has ever seen. The pottery that had marked the Lapita, those intricate, dentate-stamped vessels, began to disappear, replaced by more utilitarian plainware before vanishing altogether. They were becoming a people of wood, fiber, and bone. More importantly, they were reinventing the vessel. The single outrigger canoe, while agile, had its limits in the truly deep water of the open Pacific. During the Long Pause, the Polynesians perfected the Wā Kaulua, the double-hulled voyaging canoe.
By lashing two hulls together with a central platform, they created a vessel that possessed the stability of a raft, but the speed and tracking of a ship. These were the heavy lift vehicles of the ancient world, capable of carrying dozens of people, livestock, and seedlings across thousands of miles of salt water. When the pause finally ended, roughly around 800 to 1000 CE, the explosion of movement was breathtaking. It was as if a dam had burst. Armed with the double-hulled canoe and a perfected system of wayfinding, the Polynesians struck out into the blue void with a confidence that borders on the supernatural. They didn't just stumble upon islands, they searched for them with mathematical precision. To understand this, one must look at the concept of the expanded landfall. A navigator didn't need to hit a tiny speck of coral dead on. They looked for the signs that an island was near, the specific refractive pattern of waves bouncing off a distant shore, the presence of certain birds that only fly a set distance from land, or the faint green tint on the underside of a cloud caused by the reflection of a lagoon. They were reading the heartbeat of the planet. This second wave of migration saw the settlement of the furthest reaches of the Polynesian Triangle. To the north, they crossed the equator to find the emerald peaks of Hawaii. To the southeast, they navigated toward the lonely outpost of Rapa Nui or Easter Island. These were not desperate flights of refugees, but planned expeditions of colonization. They brought with them a transported landscape. A voyaging canoe was a microcosm of their world, packed with the canoe plants, taro, yams, breadfruit, bananas, and sugarcane. They brought pigs, dogs, and chickens. They were carrying an entire ecosystem in the belly of a wooden ship, ensuring that wherever they landed, they could recreate the world they had left behind. This was deliberate environmental engineering on a grand scale, turning volcanic rocks into lush, productive gardens. Perhaps the most staggering feat of this era was the likely contact with South America. For decades, historians whispered about the sweet potato paradox. The sweet potato is native to the Andes, yet it was a staple crop across Polynesia long before European arrival. Furthermore, the Polynesian word for the vegetable, kumara, bears a striking resemblance to the Quechua word kumara. The conclusion is as logical as it is humbling. Polynesian navigators likely reached the coast of South America, traded with the indigenous peoples there, and sailed back into the sunset, carrying the sweet potato with them to spread across the islands. They had bridged the gap between the Old World and the New long before the Viking longships touched Newfoundland, where Columbus saw the Caribbean. The Pacific was not a void to them, it was a bridge. As they pushed further into the corners of the triangle, the societies began to diverge, shaped by the unique geographies of their new homes. In Hawaii, the abundance of fresh water and volcanic soil allowed for the development of complex, highly stratified chiefdoms and sophisticated aquaculture systems. On the isolated shores of Rapa Nui, the settlers began to carve the moai, those massive stone sentinels that speak of a society obsessed with ancestral power and spiritual permanence. Every island was a laboratory of human social organization. But no matter how far they drifted, the core tenets of the navigator remained. They maintained a profound spiritual connection to the mana, the life force of the world, and tapu, the sacred laws of balance and restriction. The final Great Migration occurred around 1200 to 1300 CE, directed toward the southwest. Navigators following the migration patterns of the long-tailed cuckoo noticed a consistent flight path heading toward a massive landmass. This was the discovery of Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, known today as New Zealand. For a people accustomed to the perpetual summer of the tropics, Aotearoa was a shock. It was a sprawling, temperate land of massive trees, alpine mountains, and strange flightless birds like the giant moa. Here, the Polynesian settlers became the Maori. They had to adapt their tropical crops to a cooler climate, reinventing their clothing from flax rather than bark cloth, and developing a new style of architecture to withstand the southern winters. Aotearoa was the last major habitable landmass on Earth to be reached by humans, the final chapter in a journey that had begun in Southeast Asia millennia prior. By the 14th century, the map of Oceania was complete. From the tiny atolls of Micronesia to the high islands of Tahiti, a vast network of kinship and trade pulsed across the water. Though separated by thousands of miles, these cultures shared a common foundation. They were the masters of the sea, living in a world where the horizon was not a limit, but a promise. They had built a civilization that relied not on the permanence of stone cities, but on the fluidity of movement and the preservation of oral knowledge. Their history was written in the stars and the currents, a record held in the minds of the master wayfinders who continued to guide their people through the shifting tides of the great ocean. However, this era of undisputed maritime sovereignty was approaching a transformative crossroads. As the Maori were establishing their iwi, or tribes, in the forests of Aotearoa, and the Hawaiian alii were consolidating power under the shadow of Mauna Kea, another world was beginning to stir far to the west. On the other side of the planet, a different kind of navigator was beginning to look toward the horizon, driven by different hungers for gold, for spice, and for empire. The isolation of Oceania, which had allowed these remarkable cultures to flourish in a unique harmony with the sea, was about to be challenged by the arrival of wooden ships from a world that viewed the ocean as a barrier to be conquered, rather than a welcoming path. This collision would forever alter the fluid nation and bring the age of the great voyagers into a new, more turbulent light. The quiet of the Pacific was about to be broken by the sound of foreign sails snapping in the wind.
These sails, heavy with the salt of the Atlantic and the dust of European ports, belonged to the fleet of Ferdinand Magellan. In 1520, after a grueling passage through the treacherous strait that would eventually bear his name, Magellan emerged into an expanse of water so startlingly calm that he christened it the Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. To Magellan and his starving crew, the Pacific was not a home or a network of ancestral pathways. It was a vast, terrifying void, a blue desert that stood between them and the fabled wealth of the Spice Islands. For 98 days, the 3 ships of the Spanish expedition crawled across the southern sea, their crews reduced to eating sawdust and leather rats to survive. They sailed past countless islands, their lack of accurate longitude keeping the vibrant societies of Polynesia just over the horizon, hidden by the curvature of the earth. When they finally made landfall in the Marianas, the encounter set a grim tone for the centuries to follow. The Europeans, obsessed with the concept of private property, viewed the locals' curiosity and communal sharing as theft, leading to a violent skirmish that foreshadowed the fundamental misunderstandings that would define the era of contact. The Spanish were soon followed by others, driven by the dual engines of the Counter-Reformation and the hunt for the mythical Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. This imaginary continent was thought by European geographers to be a necessary weight to balance the globe, a land of gold and grandeur that surely awaited a Christian discoverer. In 1567, Álvaro de Mendaña set out from Peru, stumbling upon the Solomon Islands. He named them after the biblical king, hoping to convince the Spanish crown that he had found the source of the gold for the Temple of Jerusalem. Yet the Pacific proved elusive. Mendaña's second voyage, decades later, was a disaster of disease and internal mutiny, and the Solomon Islands themselves were lost to European maps for 2 centuries, their location obscured by the primitive navigational tools of the time.
The Spanish brought with them the cross and the sword, but they found the Pacific too vast to swallow. Their influence remained largely confined to the northern routes between Manila and Acapulco, leaving the heart of Oceania to continue its traditional rhythms for a little while longer. By the mid-17th century, the Dutch entered the fray, approaching the Pacific from their strongholds in the East Indies. In 1642, Abel Tasman, sailing for the Dutch East India Company, skirted the southern coast of Australia and crossed the sea to encounter a great land uplifted high. He had reached the western coast of Aotearoa, the South Island of New Zealand. The meeting was swift and bloody. In a bay he named Murderer's Bay, now known as Golden Bay, a misunderstanding between the Dutch sailors and the Ngati Tumatakokiri led to a violent clash. Tasman, spooked by the ferocity of the Maori warriors and their intimidating haka, sailed away without ever setting foot on the shore. He recorded the land on his charts as Staten Land, but it would eventually be renamed Nova Zelandia. For the Dutch, the Pacific was a commercial barrier, a place where the risks to their merchant ships outweighed the potential profits of the spice trade. They retreated to the known waters of Indonesia, leaving the Great South Land as a series of disconnected lines on a map. The true transformation of the Pacific began in the late 18th century, the era of the Enlightenment. This was a period when European curiosity shifted from the purely mercantile to the scientific, though the two were always inextricably linked. In 1768, Lieutenant James Cook of the British Royal Navy departed on the HMS Endeavour, ostensibly to observe the transit of Venus from Tahiti. But Cook carried secret instructions from the Admiralty to search for the southern continent and to claim any new lands for King George III. Unlike the Spanish who came before him, Cook was equipped with the latest technology of the age, including the marine chronometer, which finally allowed for the precise measurement of longitude. He brought with him botanists, artists, and astronomers, turning the Pacific into a laboratory for the Western world. In Tahiti, Cook encountered a society that both fascinated and baffled him. The Tahitians possessed a sophisticated social hierarchy and a deep spiritual connection to the land and sea, yet they lacked the metal tools and firearms that the Europeans equated with civilization. It was here that Cook met Tupaia, a high priest and master navigator from the island of Raiatea. Tupaia was a living repository of the ancient wayfinding knowledge that had populated the Pacific. When he stepped aboard the Endeavour, he was able to name over 70 islands and provide their relative positions, directions, and sailing times without the use of a single instrument. Tupaia became the bridge between two worlds, guiding Cook through the labyrinthine archipelagos of the Society Islands and south to New Zealand. For the first time, the Western world began to grasp the true scale of the Polynesian migrations. Yet, even as Cook admired the skills of the Indians, as he called them, he continued to map the region as if it were a blank slate, replacing indigenous names with those of British aristocrats and patrons. The mapping of the Pacific was more than a scientific achievement, it was an act of possession. To the Polynesians, the ocean was a living entity, defined by the relationships between people, gods, and ancestors. To the Europeans, the ocean was a grid to be carved into sectors of influence. As Cook mapped the coasts of New Zealand and the eastern shore of Australia, he was essentially drawing the blueprints for future empires. The arrival of the Endeavour and subsequent expeditions by French explorers like Louis-Antoine de Bougainville introduced a Columbian exchange to the Pacific that was as devastating as it was transformative. Iron was the first great disruptor. A single iron nail was worth more to a Pacific Islander than any amount of gold, as it could be fashioned into hooks and tools that far outperformed bone or stone. This led to a rapid shift in local economies as communities competed for access to European trade goods. However, the ships brought more than iron and beads. They brought invisible invaders. Having lived in isolation for millennia, the peoples of Oceania had no immunity to the diseases of the Old World. Smallpox, influenza, measles, and venereal diseases swept through the islands like wildfire. In some archipelagos, the population plummeted by 80% within a decade of contact. The social fabric of the fluid nation began to fray. The authority of the Ali'i and the Ariki was often undermined when traditional prayers and rituals proved powerless against these new mysterious ailments. Into this vacuum of faith and power stepped the missionaries, who viewed the traditional cultures of the Pacific as pagan and primitive. They sought to clothe the naked, silence the ancestral chants, and replace the complex tapestries of local myth with the singular narrative of the Bible. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, the Pacific was no longer a realm of isolated island kingdoms. It had become a frontier for global capitalism. Whaling ships from New England and Britain began to hunt the leviathans of the deep, using the islands as victualling stations. Sandalwood traders and blackbirders, those who kidnapped islanders for forced labor in the sugar plantations of Queensland and Fiji, distorted the traditional labor and social structures of Melanesia and Polynesia. The introduction of the musket altered the nature of tribal warfare, turning traditional skirmishes into bloody wars of annihilation, most notably in the musket wars of Aotearoa. The stage of Oceania was now crowded with new actors: the merchant, the missionary, the whaler, and the bureaucrat. The silence of the great ocean was gone, replaced by the clamor of a world that was rapidly shrinking, drawing the distant reaches of the Pacific into the shadow of the New World.
The formalization of this shadow began not with a bang, but with the scratching of quills across parchment. While the 18th century had been defined by the thrill of discovery and the clash of first contacts, the 19th century was characterized by the cold, systematic expansion of administrative control. The scramble for the Pacific was a slower, more maritime version of the scramble for Africa. While the African continent was divided by lines drawn in a Berlin conference room, the Pacific was partitioned through a series of overlapping protectorates, naval stations, and coaling depots. By the middle of the century, the informal empire of trade and religion began to solidify into the formal empire of bureaucracy. In 1840, the Treaty of Waitangi was signed in Aotearoa, intended to establish a framework for British sovereignty while nominally protecting the land rights of the Maori chiefs. It was a document born of necessity and misunderstanding, a legal bridge between two vastly different concepts of ownership and authority. The decades that followed the signing were marked by the New Zealand Wars, a series of conflicts that saw the Maori employ sophisticated trench warfare and defensive fortifications known as pa to resist the encroachment of colonial settlers. These wars were not merely about territory, they were about the survival of a social order that had existed for centuries. The eventual victory of the colonial government led to massive land confiscations, fundamentally altering the demographic and economic landscape of the islands. Further north, the Kingdom of Hawaii presented a different model of engagement. Under the Kamehameha dynasty, Hawaii transformed into a modernized, literate, and internationally recognized sovereign state. It had its own constitution, a diplomatic corps, and a seat among the family of nations. Yet the strategic value of Pearl Harbor and the lucrative profits of the sugar industry made Hawaiian independence a target for American interests. In 1893, a group of businessmen, backed by United States Marines, orchestrated the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. Despite her appeals to international law and the principles of justice, the Queen was forced to relinquish her throne.
In 1898, Hawaii was formally annexed by the United States, signaling the end of the last major independent Polynesian kingdom and the beginning of an era where the Pacific would serve as the primary stage for American Pacific power. The late 19th century also saw the entrance of new colonial players. Germany, seeking its place in the sun, laid claim to northeastern New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and parts of Micronesia. The French, already established in Tahiti, expanded their reach to New Caledonia, which they utilized as a penal colony. The British consolidated their hold over Fiji and the Solomon Islands. This era was defined by the Western Pacific High Commission, established in 1877 to provide a skeletal framework of British law over a vast expanse of ocean. It was a time of gunboat diplomacy, where a single naval vessel could represent the entire weight of an empire. The indigenous populations of these islands found themselves navigating a maze of new regulations, taxes, and labor requirements. The traditional authority of chiefs was often co-opted or bypassed by colonial residents and district officers. The arrival of the 20th century brought the Great War, which, while centered in Europe, had immediate repercussions in the Pacific. German colonies were quickly seized by Australian, New Zealander, and Japanese forces. The subsequent Treaty of Versailles distributed these territories as mandates under the League of Nations, effectively reshuffling the colonial deck without granting any genuine autonomy to the inhabitants. Japan's acquisition of the Marshall, Caroline, and Mariana Islands marked a significant shift in the balance of power. The Pacific was no longer just a collection of colonies, it was becoming a strategic chessboard for the looming confrontation between the rising sun of Japan and the established interests of the West. World War II transformed the Pacific in ways that were both sudden and cataclysmic. For many islanders, the war arrived as a literal storm of steel. Places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, which had been quiet outposts of empire, became synonymous with some of the most brutal combat in human history. The Cactus Air Force and the logistical miracle of the American war machine introduced islanders to the staggering industrial might of the modern world. The war also broke the myth of European invincibility as colonial administrations collapsed under Japanese occupation, and later as American forces demonstrated a new kind of global hegemony. The post-war era did not bring a return to the status quo. The 1940s and 50s ushered in the Atom Age, and the Pacific was chosen as the primary laboratory for the world's most destructive weapons. From the American tests at Bikini and Eniwetok to the British tests at Christmas Island and the French at Mururoa, the empty ocean was revealed to be anything but. The displacement of populations, the environmental degradation, and the long-term health effects of radiation became a central grievance for Pacific peoples. This period saw the birth of the nuclear-free and independent Pacific movement, which linked the struggle for environmental justice with the broader push for decolonization. The mid-20th century was the season of independence. Samoa led the way in 1962, becoming the first small island state to regain its sovereignty. Over the next 3 decades, a wave of decolonization swept across the region. Fiji, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and the various nations of Micronesia emerged as sovereign states, each grappling with the challenges of nation-building in a post-colonial world. These new nations had to reconcile traditional customs, known as the Pacific Way, with the administrative structures inherited from their former colonizers. They faced the logistical difficulties of governing scattered archipelagos with limited resources, and the economic pressures of a globalized market. As the 20th century drew to a close, a cultural renaissance began to take root. The successful 1976 voyage of the Hokulea, a traditional double-hulled voyaging canoe from Hawaii to Tahiti, proved that the ancient Polynesian navigators were not drift voyagers, but master mariners. This sparked a revival in traditional navigation, language, and arts across the Pacific. It was a reclamation of identity that challenged the Eurocentric narratives of the past. The people of Oceania were no longer just subjects of history. They were once again the authors of their own destiny. In the 21st century, Oceania faces a new and existential challenge: climate change. The rising tides of the Pacific are not merely a distant threat, but a current reality for low-lying atolls like Kiribati and Tuvalu. The ocean, which has been the lifeblood of these cultures for millennia, now threatens to swallow their ancestral lands. Yet the response of the Pacific nations has been one of leadership rather than despair. They have become the moral conscience of the global community, advocating for environmental stewardship and sustainable development. Today, Oceania stands as a region of profound resilience. From the ancient voyagers who first crossed the horizon to the modern activists fighting for the survival of their islands, the story of the Pacific is one of connection. It is a story that reveals the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway, a vast blue continent that unites rather than divides. As the sun sets over the great expanse of the Pacific, the legacy of the wayfinders continues, guiding the nations of the sea toward a future that remains as vast and as full of potential as the open ocean itself. The silence of the deep has been replaced not by the clamor of the old world, but by the confident voices of a people who have always known that their home is the greatest horizon.